Welcome everybody to pre-show for this very special stream. Tonight it's going to be my first impressions of Call of the Netherdeep. We'll get started at the bottom of the hour. And in the meantime, you can continue listening to the dulcet tones of Sirenscape on the audio. Alright, have all the monitors set up. Hope everybody had a good Friday. Good evening, viewers. Hope you're doing well. You have any questions during the show about things in Call of the Netherdeep? Let me know. I will try to address those as long as they don't give too many spoilers. I want this to be kind of a first impression of things that I think are cool, things that might be nice to integrate into a homebrew campaign, but I don't want to give away too much of the plot because that would ruin fun for people who are looking forward to playing it. And don't want to do that. Alright, we're going to get started in a few seconds here. Why don't we, in our tavern here, why don't we go step away from where the musicians are playing and come over here to a nice little corner by the fire. Yeah, that's nice. That's nice. Alright, that is better. Hey everybody, welcome to this very special stream. I am DM Galabond, and tonight I'm going to be taking you through my first impressions of the brand new Sourcebook from Wizards of the Coast and Critical Role that dropped this week for D&D 5e, and that is Call of the Netherdeep. Anyone who is a fan of Critical Role, and let's face it, if we love D&D, it's hard to imagine anybody who loves D&D that's not a fan of what they do over there. They do some really great stuff. But this is yet another campaign book that they have released, and it's got some pretty cool features that we can look at and tease out and perhaps put into our own campaigns. So, without further ado, I am going to go on in, and for this one, since the slides are set up a little bit differently, I'm just going to go ahead and turn the camera off because until we get out of the slides, because I just want to make sure you guys can see everything that's on here. All right, so Call of the Netherdeep introduces more details about the cosmology of Matt Mercer's homebrew game setting, which is Exandria. And the story involves an ancient hero whose origins are tied to the great schism in the past that split the pantheon into the gods of goodness, called the prime deities, and the gods of evil, who are called the betrayer gods. And now, Matt Mercer, like many DMs, he did not go out and he did not invent a whole pantheon. He took existing D&T deities and he put his own spin on them. But he made it easy for himself. And that's one thing to think about in your own homebrew world. You know, if you imagine yourself, or if you are a great storyteller and a great creator of, really epic and powerful NPCs and characters and deities and stuff like that, that's fine to go ahead and make up your own pantheon. I always find that since, the people at Wizards of the Coast have been giving us resources for 50 years now, almost 50 years now, it's a lot easier to offload a lot of that cognitive, effort onto them and just, assemble a pantheon of deities from the ones that they've already given us. You don't have to use a pantheon from whole cloth. You can pick and choose and put things together and create a pantheon out of your favorite Greyhawk deities, your favorite Forgotten Realms deities, your favorite deities from other settings, and even from other IPs if you want to go and pull them into your D&D campaign. It takes a lot of work to think about, all of the deities and what they would do and how they would, how they would affect the world and everything like that, and build that all up from whole cloth before you even get around to telling any stories that involve players coming in and playing in your setting. So that's just something that I like about the way he does his pantheon there. And there are also some interesting origin stories in this one for some of the races of Exandria, and a very different take on the Drow that provides some inspiration for DMs that want to avoid the cookie-cutter racial stereotypes in your own homebrew setting. So if we look at the origin, or if we look at the introduction of this campaign, it provides a brief history of the cosmic origins of the Exandrian pantheon and introduces an NPC that becomes the target of a campaign-long quest. And the introduction provides a thumbnail sketch of the primary locations and a brief overview of the plot and level ratings of each section of the campaign. And, as many of the 5th edition campaigns do, they will call out, okay, when you get to this section, they should be level XYZ. When they get to this section, they should be level whatever. And it gives you that kind of roadmap if you want to use the milestone method of doing leveling for your campaigns. Now, it's important to note that this campaign is designed to start with characters at level 3. And in the introduction, it points you to another adventure out of one of the previous Critical Role source books for 5e, if you want to take that and raise characters from 1st level to 3rd level and have them prepared to run this particular campaign. Also, another interesting thing that they bring in here is they bring in the concept of a rival team of adventurers that are NPCs. And this rival team, your PCs will meet them in the first chapter, but then there are opportunities and story events where they will continue to run into these same people throughout the entire campaign. And so what they've done is they actually have given you 3 different tiers or 3 different challenge ratings for each of these characters to represent how, as you get to different stages of the campaign, they have continued to grow and evolve and get more powerful along with your PCs. And this kind of mechanic is really cool if you it's something that we talk about a little bit, and sometimes we think about if we have adversaries or recurring villains or things like that, where you have a major NPC that winds up sort of leveling up and continuing to be a suitable challenge for the party when they meet at different times throughout the campaign. But here they take an entire separate group of adventurers and they put them in as NPCs, and they also give you along the way different ways that these NPCs can become allies, or can become competitors, or can become outright adversaries of the party. And for each stage along the way, and every time you meet them, there are notes on how the reactions of each member of this rival party are gauged depending on what their relationship to the PCs are. So that's a very interesting element, and something that can be kind of cool to look at if you feel the need to have a rival group. Now, the rival group makes sense in this story because of the nature of the campaign, but I don't think a rival group would necessarily make sense in every D&D campaign. But it's a very cool thing to have here. So then as we go from the introduction into the actual story of the campaign, Chapter 1 opens us up on a city that's undergoing an annual festival. And this festival includes a lot of games that test skill, knowledge, strength, agility, and endurance. And these festival games culminate in an event that allows the PCs or their rivals to obtain a legendary magic item that grows in power throughout the campaign. When they find it first, it's in what's called its dormant state. And then it goes into something called the active state, and then finally it reaches something called the exalted state later on in the campaign. Now, that's similar to the concept of what I've done in my Sunday campaign, where I have scaling magic items that, grow along with the planeswalkers that are the PCs in that campaign, where as they reach a new tier within the campaign, those magic items get more and more powerful. So in my case, I decided to give them 4 stages because there's 4 tiers of play. In this particular campaign, since the campaign tops out in Tier 3, there's only 3 stages to this magic item. But it's still a very cool magic item. Alright, and then in Chapter 2, the PCs travel to a city that serves as a bulwark against demonic incursion into the world that stems from some of the primordial events of Exandria's distant past. And during the journey, there are various encounters and opportunities to solidify whether the rival group will be allies or opponents in the coming stages of the campaign. And this, of course, is the cover art. And what you see here surrounding the central figure is you see the members of the rival adventuring group. An adventuring group led by an orc that includes a goblin, an ogre, a human, and a drow. So it's a very diverse game world that you are going into, and the stereotypical tropes of monstrous humanoids, cast in the role of evil, that doesn't hold sway here. Culturally, there are differences in terms of where you are in the world and uh, what tribes or what families or what groups of these monstrous humanoids you find, whether they are predominantly good, predominantly evil, or there's a whole array of them. Just as there's a whole array of good and evil humans, good, evil, and neutral humans. And then this central character here is someone that is the person that is the object of the campaign-long quest to locate that person. All right, so this image here on this slide, this is the city of Bazzoxan. And Bazzoxan is that fortress city, and in the center of that city is a great temple, and that temple is one that was consecrated long, long ago to the betrayer gods, and now that temple is guarded by the people in this fortress city, because there are portals to the abyss within that temple, and that temple has become the source of demonic incursions into the world in this area. And so in essence, this city of Bazzoxan is the first line of defense. And so the plot of the campaign takes the characters to this city, where they are going to try to find out more information about this fancy magic item that they have discovered. And as they begin to do their exploration, well, of course, they are going to be drawn into this great big temple here. And there's a lot of interesting things that happen in that temple. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And that temple's called the Betrayer's Rise. They also encounter factions that are operating within Bazzoxan that are based in a completely different continent. And these factions are all here and all kind of studying things around the Betrayer's Rise, and all for slightly different reasons. And they all sort of intersect with the story of this magic item that the parties have. So some of these factions will, if they find out the PCs have it, some of them will, of course, want to take that magic item for themselves. And other factions, will desperately want to try to keep that magic item from falling into the wrong hands, at least as they see it. So then Chapter 4 shifts gears, going from the city of Bazzoxan to a great desert metropolis in the continent of Marquette. And this is where all of those factions that they met in Chapter 3 are based. And so as they go into, and I always want to call the city Anchorage, but that's a city out of World of Warcraft. Maybe it's Anchoral, something like that. But is the name of this city here. But it kind of gives you a feel like it's a cross between modern Las Vegas, the Cairo of the ancient Egyptian Empire, and some sort of steampunk fantasy city that has one of the world's largest flying ship ports, if you will. All right. And the action shifts to the heart of these factions and the stomping grounds of these factions, and the party will have a chance to join forces with one of 3 of the major factions that operate in this area. They discover more about the artifact, how it's connected to the ancient ruins below Ank'Haral, and this knowledge is gained as they begin a series of missions for whatever faction they choose to ally with. Now, in Chapter 5, they go underneath the city of Ank'Haral and into the ancient ruins of a city that is very central to the great calamity of the gods that saw the Pantheon split in the first place. And continuing their faction missions brings them to this drowned place, which is very interesting. It's a desert area where Ank'Haral is, but the city that's underneath it is drowned and completely flooded with water. So it's a very interesting dichotomy there. And the continuing the faction missions bring us to the drowned place, and the artifact they found in Chapter 1 reaches its ultimate stage of development by this time in the campaign. Okay, and then in Chapter 6, the party finally reaches the demiplane known as the Netherdeep. And in this chapter, they finally begin to fit all the pieces of the puzzle together and learn how the magic item they have is connected with an ancient hero that they've kind of been hearing about, and even in some cases getting vague visions from all throughout the campaign. And how this ancient hero suffers a curse, and the impact that that curse continues to have on the world. And of course, there's all kinds of new monsters and new heroes, and one of those new monsters that you'll run into is a monster called a Sword Wraith, which is a type of undead. And there's a couple of different kinds of Sword Wraiths that are introduced in this campaign. So that's pretty cool, and you get to... In this area of the Netherdeep, there's lots of aberrations, there are lots of undead, and there are lots of other very strange monsters that are of different creature types, but are affected by the properties of this Netherdeep plane, in the same way that a demiplane such as Barovia in the Curse of Strahd has an impact on the creatures that are native to it. So Chapter 7, the PCs finally reached their goal. It's now in this ultimate chapter of the campaign where they have to decide if they're going to follow the goals of their chosen faction, pursue an independent path once they've learned everything they can, and they have several choices about how they can resolve this hero that they've been looking for, this ancient hero. There's multiple ways that they can deal with their ultimate findings, and each of the ways that they deal with that has a different kind of impact on the world of Exandria. So it's kind of a very interesting and fun way that, it's not either you do this and you win, you do this and you lose. It's you make this choice, and that sets into motion another sort of thing. So what that, it gives you an idea of what those consequences are, but if you want to continue that story, and you and your characters want to continue following what happens beyond there, then you as the DM have to kind of come up with what the rest of the story is. So it's very cool that it gives you a resolution to this story, but the resolution of this story can serve as the launching pad for yet another story that goes on to higher and higher levels. All right, and now we're going to go ahead and we're going to switch gears, and we're going to go to more of a deep dive through the book. And I'll talk a little bit about the elements that I really like from this source book, and what I think are some of the cool things. And remember, if you guys have any questions about this source book that I might be able to answer, you can go ahead and throw those in the chat, and I will be looking at that throughout the time that we are here. All right, so obviously we have a table of contents, and it gives us all of this information here. A couple of things I want to talk about from the or several things I want to talk about from the introduction include the adventuring rivals. One of the cool things that is provided in here is in Appendix A, when we are introduced to these rivals. One of the very interesting things that they give us is they give us battle chatter. And battle chatter, you can kind of think of it as trash talk. Trash talk that these particular rivals will give the PCs if it comes down to fighting them. And so each of the 5 rivals has several different sayings. And I'm reminded when you, if anyone has played some of the old BioWare games, like BioWare made several PC games for that were based on D&D back in 3rd edition and 4th edition. And as you played through that, you could have different hero personalities. And these hero personalities were all voiced, and they all had a set of maybe half a dozen, or depending on them, a dozen different things that they would say, and you could sort of prompt them by clicking on something to say, order an attack. And each one of them would have a different way of calling for an attack. And so they've kind of given you a few notes here to capture just a little bit of the personality of each of these rivals in terms of what they would say if you were in a fight with them. So I think that's a really cool touch that they have done here. And if you have some important NPCs, it can be really kind of interesting when you're planning a fight with them, that you can sort of jot down a few notes for yourself about these are the things that the NPC would say in terms of trash talk during a battle or during a fight. And they might be it might be something that your PCs would enjoy. All right. Then when we take a look at the actual magic item, this is something called the Jewel of 3 Prayers. And it's a scaling magic item that moves through 3 states: the state of dormant, awakened, and exalted. And in each of these states, some static bonuses increase and some additional properties and charges unlock. So let me go over here, and I will go to the magic items, and okay, Jewel of 3 Prayers. That's what we have, and it's got its 3 different forms. And when you first find it, it's in this sort of plain form here. In the second form, it opens up here, and in the third form, it comes up here. And in the dormant state, it gives you a +1 bonus to AC while you're wearing the jewel. While you're wearing or holding it, you can cause it to shed bright light. In the awakened state, it has all of those properties, but then some of the following benefits improve. Instead of 3 charges, it gets 5 charges every day. And instead of a +1 AC bonus, it gives you a +2 AC bonus. And then it had some additional properties at the awakened state. So additional things you can use charges on and whatnot. Then in its final exalted state, the AC bonus comes to +3, the charges increase to 7, and then there's some additional properties. So you gain the ability to breathe water, gain a swimming speed, and it gives your allies also the ability to breathe water. And of course, that's important because a lot of the late stages of this campaign are happen underwater. So it's nice, nice to have that. And then it gains this bonus action that you can teleport. Teleport a short distance, and also when you arrive at the location, it causes a discharge of radiant energy. So you can literally, as a bonus action, you can move yourself or your party members around and put them in different places on the battlefield and initially do some damage and also potentially stun the enemy. Or I'm sorry, not stun them, but blind them. So that is a really cool item. Now, that works a little bit different and also a little bit similar to the scaling magic items that I've created for my Sunday campaign. There are some static bonuses in those magic items that do increase with each tier, and it also gains some additional abilities. But as planeswalkers, each of the items is different and is kind of tailored to each person. And of course, in my game, every PC who becomes a planeswalker gets one of these scaling items. In this particular campaign, just the party and one person in the party gets this item. And so several of these properties will only affect the person wearing the item. And then when it gets to its exalted stage, then it confers some additional bonuses onto people that are nearby. So that's kind of a unique idea. If you want to take something from that, you might have an item that either is designed for one of the players in your party in your homebrew campaign, and does something like that where it gives that person more abilities, and then later on it confers abilities onto the rest of the party. Or you might want to go the route of taking a look at sort of splitting up some of those features and giving one of these scaling items to each member of your party, and having them perhaps do something on their own, or perhaps taking a cue out of Magic the Gathering, doing something where if each person activates their magic item, then the synergy of that activation causes some other bonus that gets conferred onto the party as a whole. So those are some different ways you can think about doing something like that with a scaling item. All right, and one of the other cool things about this particular campaign goes back to the introduction, and that is the description of the starting city. So this starting city is named Jigao, and the city of Jigao undergoes a festival. And as you can see from this particular picture right here, Jigao, well, all of the traditional playable races are decidedly in the minority. You have a lot of orcs and goblins and lizard folk and even ogres that live and work in this city of Jigao. And Jigao is nominally a part of the Kryn dynasty. The Kryn dynasty is led by and populated mostly by dark elves, but these are not your typical dark elves. These are dark elves that are maybe more after Driz Duerden's own heart. They are dark elves that have thrown off the yoke or fought against the corruption, leadership, influence, if you will, of Lolth. And these dark elves have adapted to living on the surface. And they, this Kryn dynasty serves as kind of a very well-respected peacekeeping force here in this part of the world. So it's a really good study when you look at this city and you look at the roles that these different, as we might normally think of them, monstrous humanoids play. You can get an idea of how you might want to turn these into, or turn these types of creatures against the normal racial stereotypes in your own homebrew setting. So it gives us some very interesting ideas as DMs here. All right. Let's see. We've already talked a little bit about Chapter 1 and the festival in Chapter 1. In Chapter 2, this is a great study for DMs of how to do an interesting travelogue. A few influential people on YouTube lately have put out some videos about how travel is so boring. I'm thinking of Jenny Dye, who I think she was somebody that was with Felicia Day in one of the properties that Felicia started years ago. But Jenny has this video out there about D&D, and it's all about how to make your travel more interesting. Well, this entire chapter is a really good example of an interesting travel sequence. It focuses on the starting city of Jigao to the destination, which is arriving at Baziksan, and there are opportunities to RP with these rivals that you met during the games in Jigao. And also there's some very interesting waypoints that there are things to do there. So it really breaks up the travel instead of just, days and days of travel and, the PC's trying to decide, okay, how do we forage for food, how do we hunt for whatever, and the DM rolling for random encounters, it really gives you a lot of different things to do along the way. So it kind of breaks that travel up, and because you have these other things happening, it can make it feel like it's more of an epic journey, and that a lot happens along the way to get to your destination. So looking at this chapter can give you as a DM some ideas of how you can make travel maybe more interesting for your players in your own campaign. Then let's see. We've talked about the temple that was sacred to the betrayer gods, that is in this city of Bazzoxan, and within the city of Bazzoxan, the Betrayer's Rise is that temple. Or within the Betrayer's Rise, you have not only portals to the abyss that will sometimes spawn demons that plague the city and the surrounding areas, but there's some very strange features once you get inside that temple. And one of those features means that no two parties that enter ever experience the same route throughout the temple. This kind of idea of chaos and randomness that is associated with the abyss actually seems to affect the layout of the temple. And every time a party goes in, they have a different experience about the way they go through that temple. And if the same party goes in a second time, the idea is that you should change that around. Now, in the book, they give you one sort of map that maps out where all of the pre-planned encounters are, but as a DM, you could take the time, if you wanted to go into a program like Photoshop or GIMP or whatever it is that you use, and take that map and sort of cut it up into smaller pieces. And if the party has to go in and then they have to retreat for some reason and they come back, you can sort of rearrange all those pieces in a different order so that they enter by the same door from the outside, but the room they go into doesn't look the same. And then the places that they go beyond that, they're not the same places they went the last time. So that could be kind of a really cool way of bringing that concept of this temple that changes because of the chaos, be a really cool idea of how to bring that to life. And this place has some really interesting puzzles and some very interesting type of portals that make navigating it something that players will need to remain attentive if they don't want to resolve their navigation with skill checks all the time. Now, that also means that going through this place is very good for really strong role players and really strong characters that have a really, or players that have a really strong sense of character, like Matt Mercer's players on Critical Role. But if you are running a game and the players at your table, they like D&D because they get to roll dice and they get to swing weapons and they get to zap spells at their enemies and cause big gouts of damage. Whenever you have these things that require players to go through and solve puzzles or deal with traps or stuff like that, it can get a little bit challenging. So this one particular area, this temple here, called the Betrayer's Rise, that one is something that may challenge some of your players that don't like having to think a lot in their D&D game, where they just like to react to whatever it is that you throw out in front of them. All right, so in Chapter 4 of this campaign, you move from this military outpost of Bazixan to the city that is called the Jewel of Hope, Ankaral. And Ankaral is on a completely different continent. And as you see here, it's kind of got this mix of sort of futuristic steampunk thing with the flying airships, literally sailing ships that fly through the air, which is a definite trope of a lot of steampunk type fiction and steampunk fantasy. And then you have this city that in its architecture, it reminds you a lot of, some sort of fantastical version of like an ancient Cairo at the height of the Egyptian Empire. Of course, having the requisite, fantasy crystal additions and those types of things. But then when you get into the descriptions of some of the major buildings and some of the places that the PCs can go within the city, it sounds a lot like, kind of like a resort like Las Vegas, because there's lots of fancy places you can go. There's lots of casinos. There are lots of different types of entertainments. And then there's also some really cool magical technology here that helps this city of people that live in this desert. So that is, this becomes kind of the above ground home base for the PCs for the rest of the campaign, is this particular city of Ankaral. And gives you a lot of different information about how you get to Ankaral, the encounters you might have with the rivals, and then just as the Waterdeep adventure had sort of a gazetteer about Waterdeep and all of the areas here, this particular campaign includes the Ankaral gazetteer, which gives you all of the various different locations in the city and the points of interest and whatnot. And then let's see. Okay, so and Chapter 4 also introduces and fleshes out. I should say it fleshes out the factions that were introduced in the previous chapter. The ones that call this metropolis their home. It's where the PCs begin a series of quests that lead them to unlock the secrets of the scaling magic item they have and learn the true fate of the ancient hero that is responsible for their involvement in this campaign in the first place. And one of the things that they will discover about this city is that this city is built above the ruins of an ancient city destroyed in the cataclysm, and that same cataclysm that split the pantheon of the world, and that also is somehow linked to the nifty magic item that they have had since the end of Chapter 1. Alright, in Chapter 5, they finally begin to delve down into the and then here's the Chapter 4 is split up into two areas in D&D Beyond because of the length of it. Okay, that's another cool thing that I wanted to talk about. In this second part of Chapter 4, you have faction story tracks. So depending on which faction the PCs as a party decide to join, there's a series of a chain of quests or a chain of missions that they are sent on, and that in each case they start in a similar area and they kind of cross over each other in different ways, and then they all lead the PCs to, discover this rift that will eventually take them to the demi-plane of the Netherdeep. So in Chapter 5, you go into this drowned city that's called Kael Morrow. And Kael Morrow is in a flooded cavern deep beneath the foundations of Ankaral, and there's only ruins left. Nobody knows the actual name of this city, and Kael Morrow is the name that was given to it by these archaeologists that found it. And there's an interesting story related to this, the split of the pantheon, that is revealed in this chapter as to why this city was destroyed and why it is in ruins and why it is buried underneath the sands of this desert. It also has an origin story, at least in Matt Mercer's world, in terms of where some of the races came from, because that's also related to the split in the pantheon between the gods that became the prime deities and the gods that became the betrayer gods. Then there's also some interesting monsters, like there's a new kind of aboleth that's here, and several other different kind of underwater apparitions that you will find in this particular chapter, and it lets you know that, okay, there's some really strange stuff that you have heard about, but now that you're much closer to the source of it, you can really begin to see the effects of it shown in stark relief. And it begins to give the players an idea of what the consequences of some of their decisions throughout this campaign may in fact be. And by the end of this chapter, the parties will wind up learning more about a rare and powerful magical mineral that comes from this area, and they will learn more of the story of the ancient hero and his connection to the events that saw the Pantheon shattered and the city drowned in the first place. And at the end of this chapter, they find a rift that leads to the demi-plane of the Netherdeep. So then chapter 6 is all about going into that rift and exploring the Netherdeep. And there's it's a tomb of sorts that is where they're going to encounter and discover what has happened to this ancient hero. This hero manifests at times throughout the campaign in visions, and these visions, as they get closer and closer to the Netherdeep, these visions get more frequent and they get more detailed, and also this scaling magic item gains more power, and it all kind of tends to look like it's drawing them towards this area where this hero is. And there's all kinds of really different things here. And I'm reminded of a series of fantasy novels from the last 20 years or so, going back to the 1990s and all the way into the 20-teens. There was a series of novels, and I went back to them because of the Netflix series that came out, I think it was in December, called The Wheel of Time. And so I went back to the source novels for that. And there's a piece in one of the novels, I think it's the fourth or fifth novel in the series, where the main character goes to this city where the leaders of this desert people are tested. And he, because he realizes he has the blood of these people in his veins, he is sent there as part of the prophecy of his becoming this mythical character in the world. And he goes through and he understands like the complete story of this people and how they are very different today than their origins were because of all of the different things that happened to them and that shaped them. And in this particular chapter, the PCs are exposed to a series of visions that kind of tell the life story of this hero. And it really feels a lot like that sequence in the Wheel of Time novels, where the main character learns about the history of this people whose bloodline who he realizes he's from. And in this particular adventure, of course, it's hard when you're reading that. It's hard not to hear Matt Mercer's voice in your mind narrating this to you. But in the practice of what they do, they break this up by having these visions take on kind of mystic diorama sort of things, and creatures are there, so you have a little bit of exposition, and then you can have an encounter. And some of the encounters are, of course, combat, and some of them are not, and all of this kind of stuff. So it's a very cool way of thinking about, okay, telling or retelling or uncovering or exploring a myth in your homebrew world that maybe is misunderstood by most people, and even perhaps in the backstory of the PCs, they grew up hearing stories about this, and you could tell them before the game that you've always heard that it's this and this and this and this. And then as they go through the game, they come to a point and they realize, oh, all the stuff that we've heard is either not true or it's a distortion of what really is true, because as we go through and we experience these visions, or we go through this demi-plane or this area, we begin to uncover the truth and we see what really happened as opposed to what all the legends say happened. And then finally in the last chapter, you come to a point where there's 3 major conclusions for the campaign. The choice is up to the players and the PCs to make, and each one has a really different outcome for both the players, or for both the PCs, and for the world of Exandria at large. I don't really want to say any more than that, because it would wind up just making things, giving away too many spoilers to talk about more than the fact that there's just 3 different ways this can end, and each one of them, of course, has a different impact on the game and on the PCs. So, kind of in summary, looking at this campaign, it's got all the drama that you would expect from a Shakespearean play or from a Hollywood Best Picture nominee. It's very well written, and the exposition very much captures the spirit and the feel of the Critical Role campaign that you may have watched on Twitch or YouTube over the years. There are several different appendices. Dependencies for the NPCs and monsters that are unique to the campaign, for some new and unique magic items like the scaling magic item. Then there are handouts, and one handout or one set of handouts is for prizes that are related to the festival in Chapter 1. The other set of handouts is for something that are called Fragments of Suffering. And these fragments of suffering are encountered within Netherdeep itself, and they can be absorbed into a character. And when they are absorbed, they give the character a benefit and they give them a drawback. And in that respect, these fragments of suffering are a little bit like the dark gifts from the Curse of Strahd campaign. If you remember the Amber Temple and all of the sarcophagi that are in there and sort of the dark powers that inhabit those sarcophagi, if a PC goes over and touches a sarcophagus, they will be offered a gift. And they will be told about a benefit, which is true. They do get a benefit, but they also all come with a drawback. And in most cases, the drawback is pretty bad. And the benefit is incredibly useful, or can be incredibly useful, especially in a place like Barovia. But there's a reason they're called dark gifts. And that's a very similar thing that happens with these fragments of suffering, is PCs can willingly absorb these, and then there are certain conditions under which they can pass these fragments of suffering off to another PC, or when they get to a certain stage in the campaign, they are released from these fragments of suffering. And each fragment provides both benefits and drawbacks in the late stages of the campaign. The book also includes some cool bonus elements such as concept artwork and a double-sided poster map of the major metropolis of Ank'Haral and that the PCs reach, as well as the ruins of the old city and the demiplane that they explore in the final chapters. So, last but not least, I have decided that on Monday night for Monster Monday, I am going to break up the look at Strixhaven that we've been doing recently, and I'm going to focus on a monster that comes out of this campaign. And that monster is going to be a monster called the Gloomstalker. So we'll talk about the Gloomstalker, talk about where it comes from, what it does, and some of the cool ways you could take it maybe out of this campaign and drop it into your own homebrew world, as well as some ideas for how you might reskin that monster using the core stat block and put it into different settings or have it be associated with a different sort of energy source, if you will. All right. Well, that is going to do it for for my look, my first impressions. Let me go over here and see if we have any questions on this campaign. Any questions that you guys have on the Call the Netherdeep Sourcebook that you might have had if you haven't had a chance to put your hands on it yet? Go ahead and put those into the chat, and I will check those in a few minutes. In the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go into the wrap up here. I have been DM Galabond. This has been my first impressions from Call of the Netherdeep. I have 4 live streams that I do every week. So Walker of Waterdeep is my planeswalking game that happens every Sunday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Sword Coast Chronicles is the game that currently happens every Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. And then there is the Saturday Night Greyhawk, which happens on Saturday nights at 7:30 p.m. Now, Sword Coast Chronicles is a 5th edition campaign that kind of goes through the storyline of the major Wizards of the Coast campaigns. I don't deviate into the other IPs like Critical Role, partly because the kind of story I'm telling just makes more sense if it's all kept in the same world of Toril. So I don't deviate into that. But we tell a homebrew story and we weave that story together by going through various different elements of those campaigns. Thursday night, last night, they just concluded an epic multi-session battle from Storm King's Thunder against Imrith, the Doom of the Desert. And that was a long drawn out battle because not only was it the PCs, but they had 4 giants that were with them and 4 metallic dragons that were with them. And of course, what that meant is in Imrith's lair, I had to have many more waves of defenders so that that battle would feel like a challenge. Because if you had that many, even if you're fighting against an ancient dragon, if you have that many attackers, that could, very quickly become a lopsided and overwhelming fight. But there were some very tense moments in those sessions in that battle, and it was quite a bit of fun. I think everybody enjoyed it. Then Saturday Night Greyhawk, we do a 2nd edition D&D game, and we are currently playing through the original Temple of Elemental Evil. So it's an adventure straight from the days when Gary Gygax was, shaking his finger at adventurers and saying, "Okay, you do this, you're going to be sorry." And you let the dice happen. You let the dice do whatever they're going to do, and you wind up with a lot more dead PCs than you do in later editions of the game. So that is pretty fun because everybody is getting a chance to experience the old rules and the origins of where campaigns like the Princes of the Apocalypse had their original inspiration. It was very much, Princes of the Apocalypse was very much inspired by the original Temple of Elemental Evil adventure. Alright, so let me go back here. Alright, well, viewers, thank you so much for hanging out. I don't see any questions. Go ahead and drop some questions on the YouTube if you think about it later on. And leave some comments on the video when this gets posted over there. I have been DM Galabon. Appreciate you guys being here. If you haven't done it already, please subscribe to the YouTube channel. Follow us or subscribe over on Twitch. And we do have Patreon out there. You can find the links to all of that on either YouTube or on Twitch. And that'll help us do even more stuff on the channel. All right, everyone. Hope you have a wonderful weekend. Take care, everybody. Good night now.